Welcome to the Yoga Voice, a podcast by City Yoga, School of Yoga and Health. Our guests discuss how the contemporary practice of this ancient art transforms the lives of individuals and communities in the Midwest and beyond. City Yoga has been a center for the practice of yoga and yoga teacher training since opening in 2002. Join us as we explore how yoga inspires and transforms.
Greetings all, Dave Sims here at the Yoga Voice, and I am so incredibly excited for the podcast we have for you today. I had an amazing conversation with an author of several very cutting-edge books on yoga and meditation. He's a yoga teacher. He's a leading voice in modern yoga. He's a former social worker and U.S. Army Airborne Ranger, co-founder of the Yoga and Recovery Conference, as well as Communities Rising, a yoga teacher training program for communities of color. Rolf Gates joining us here today. And this will be a first for us because we're doing this recording remotely. We usually have everyone live, so we sit face to face, but we're using technology and experimenting with a little remote recording. So excited about that as well. And we just covered a multitude of topics. Rolf talked about his experience of coming into recovery and coming into yoga and then catching that wave of early explosion in the yoga world. And our topics, we jumped all over the place, from how he became such a renowned facilitator of experiential learning, how he's found ways to bridge gaps in learning and reach communities that had maybe been overlooked or not had the accessibility to some of the teachings that some of us take for granted. We dug into his recovery story and his early journey into yoga and meditation. He talked about some of the exciting things he has going on today, from working in his own podcast coming out soon, along with retreats and conferences. And he just has a very full calendar of exciting events and just living life to the fullest. So with that, we are so excited. We'll just get this thing started and take a little deeper dive with Rolf Gates. Welcome, Rolf.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Great to be here.
Well, I always like to start off these interviews with a question about what is inspiring you within the yoga world or yoga community today?
There's a lot of different things. I'm going to lead off with, what is my own personal kind of learning curve these days, and then how that translates into what I see going on in the larger yoga community. I started teaching yoga, primarily because I enjoyed going to class and I just wanted to be more involved in something I was really enjoying and getting a lot out of from a personal, wellness, mental health standpoint, quality of life standpoint. And, how I learned to teach yoga and how I taught yoga was very analogous to being a movement instructor. I was an aerobics instructor in the 80s. And so there was a lot of similarities, in terms of how I was interacting with people, what my role was in people's lives at the beginning of my teaching. I've been a teacher now for 22 years. And as the years have gone on and I've spent more and more time training other teachers and been asked to be, to bring yoga into more and more spaces. I work in a meditation community. I'm working in a medical environment. I'm working with recovering people. I'm working with veterans. I'm working in a lot of different domains. And as I've been asked to bring yoga into more and more spaces, it's given me a chance to see yoga as something different. And today I see what excites me about yoga is that I see it as an ideal setting to kind of flesh out what's possible, or flesh out what's possible in terms of experiential education. I see a yoga teacher now not as a movement instructor, but as an experiential educator. And what we do is our classes are where someone learns the principles and practices of yoga experientially. And because of that, it's made me just a passionately interested in this idea of experiential education and how experiential education can make education in general more accessible to, increasingly diverse communities. One of the things that I'm a creator of is Communities Rising, and it's a yoga teacher training that is specifically for self-designated people of color. And what's happening in that space is a conversation about making yoga relevant to underserved communities and to kind of the widest kind of cross-section of cultures imaginable, and backgrounds imaginable, and bodies imaginable, and orientations imaginable, and spiritual disciplines imaginable. And so that conversation is really about how do we educate effectively in the most diverse circumstances that you can imagine. And, some circumstance, an example of even like the physical containers, some people are working in prisons, some people are working in shelters, other people are working in schools. So even like physically, the circumstances are very different, let alone the age groups or the capacities of the individuals who are being educated. And so this has just put a lot of, it's put into stark relief how really there's the health and wellness someone can achieve by adopting the practices of yoga, right? The principles and practices of yoga. And we close the gap between that person and that well-being by creating opportunities for them not to kind of learn from us, but to learn from their own experience. And so this is like my passion. It's like, wow, I mean, I'm 55 years old. My parents were college professors, and I knew when I was a kid that my life would make sense if I was a teacher too, but I just didn't want to be like my parents. And so it wasn't until my 30s that I relented and said, okay, I'll be a teacher. And then it's been like 20 years since then of being, well, what kind of a teacher am I? And I feel like at 55, I'm like, I am an experiential educator, and I'm someone who is kind of passionate about that. And then I'm living at a time when there's a tremendous amount of research around the effects yoga is having on the brain. And meditation's having on the brain, and loving kindness meditation is having on the brain. And so people are putting people in MRIs and having them meditate, and they're watching what happens what is the process of driving neuroplasticity through meditation, and they're observing this directly in an MRI and reporting it. So I'm an experiential educator who's increasingly supported by in-depth research. I'm also an experiential educator who's supported by just the research in education that is just ongoing in the field of education, traditional education. And so there's so much information about how people learn differently. And so I'm in this cross-section of research around both education and then the effects of yoga on driving neuroplasticity in support of overall wellness and good choice making. And so it's just a great time. And in addition to that, the average person going through a yoga teacher training is not interested in just going back and teaching at a yoga studio. They want to go and reach an underserved population. They want to go back to their communities and reach people who haven't been reached before. And so all of this is just making it an extremely exciting time to be an educator in the yoga space, And I guess finally, we're also in this flexion point around inclusivity and access. And so on top of everything else, we're at a turning point around conversations within the yoga space about social justice, access, and inclusivity. And, kind of looking at, gender, race, sexual orientation, like how does the dominant culture in a given space kind of drive what is included and what's not, what voices are included and what aren't, who's welcome and who's not, who feels welcome and who's not. And so on top of everything else that's going on, we're really moving into that conversation, which has the heading of access and inclusivity and social justice. And all of it's being done, I think, from a place of generosity and the highest possible intention by everyone I'm interacting with. So it's just a really exciting time to be in yoga.
Yes, it is. And it's very inspiring and exciting indeed. So that when you're talking about the experiential learning and talking about communities rising and making these teachings accessible, it really does sound like you're filling a pretty large gap that's been in the community. So I think that's just awesome work, and it's exciting to hear about and the conversations that come out of that. And we had a group in the studio, 6 months ago, doing a training on very much conscious activism. So it was about having conversations around a broad range of topics involving a broad range of communities, and that theme of inclusivity and filling gaps where there's been, historical barriers to developing some of these teachings. And I think you really hit the key about experiential learning in the times that we're living in right now is huge. So hats off to that. And you talked about a little bit on your teaching history and what you've got going on today. I'd like to just drill down a little bit in your own history of coming into yoga, what was going on in your life, and how that has transformed you on multiple levels, as we choose to talk about. And we'll circle back to where we're at today.
Sure. Well, in the spring of 1990, I got sober through the power of prayer. I was taken by a mental health worker to my first meeting. I was stationed in Germany in the Army, and in a kind of a military physician's assistant who was also sober kind of picked me up in my bachelor's officer quarters and took me to my first meeting. And I didn't really hear much about it at the time. I wasn't paying very close attention, but I did win the lottery. Apparently there was a lottery at this meeting, and if you won the lottery, you got the book, and there was like the textbook of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I won the lottery, and I was outside smoking a cigarette, and someone came out to tell me I'd won the lottery, and I'm like, I was delighted. I don't remember actually being in the lottery, but I got the book, and I kept it. I'm like, great, I won something, and I took it home. And a couple of weeks later, I was hung over on a Monday morning, May 21st. I was reading it. Because it's one of the things I would do when I was hungover is just lie in bed, read books. And I was out of books, so I read this book, and it described addiction in a way that I could identify with. And it said that people with this issue in our organization have used prayer for help. And I was like, well, I'll give that a try. And I prayed that morning, so May 21st, 1990, and I felt an immediate shift. It was like a visceral sense that everything was going to be okay. And I was just off to the races. I mean, I haven't had the desire to drink since then. About 2 days later, my drinking buddy from that time just shared with me that I was excitedly telling him how I was sober now, and I was living my new life. And he was just like, yeah, my uncle's sober. He's still going to meetings 20 years later. And that irritated me. But sure enough, before long, I went to my next meeting. Met my sponsor, and the two of us decided it was time for me to go to rehab. So I went to rehab for 6 weeks, And during that 6-week rehab, I became a kind of lifelong learner of spiritual